Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to see you.
You.
This is the class. This is my first hour, group one of three.
Morning, guys.
Alrighty, well, I'm just going to let Michael get started with his first question, so come on up.
Okay.
Where do you find the inspiration for your books, and why did you choose to write about different countries instead of the U.S.? And another one is, how did you decide on those specific countries?
Okay. Let's see. It wasn't like, oh, always wanted to go to India. How can I find a reason to go there? I was very drawn to this topic of child trafficking because of the incredible injustice of it. And my quick and early research showed that it was really a problem everywhere, but that in India and Nepal, it was really very, very significant, and that the two countries had begun to take steps to address trafficking. So there was a ready-made community there that I could go and meet with who could help me and walk me through the research and get me into the brothels and introduce me to the girls who'd been rescued. So I just took a flyer because I was feeling such urgency to get the book written. It was probably a good thing that I went there and not to, a Spanish-speaking country. There are lots of people who are trafficked from Latin America to the United States. There are lots of people trafficked from China. There are lots of people trafficked from the Eastern European countries to the United States. But there was a lot more danger in those places, either because the governments were more corrupt and violent, or because of the language barrier. At least in India, there were a lot of people who spoke English that I could communicate with. So that said, there's a danger, I think, always in trying to insert yourself into another culture and pretend that you know what's going on there. Like to write from the point of view of a girl from Nepal when I'm a middle-aged woman from New York City is kind of risky. There's people talk about cultural appropriation. Are you using someone else's culture for your profit? Or to work out your own psychological stuff or whatever. But the truth was, nobody else was writing this book. And I took the steps to go ahead and get into that culture and to respectfully do the research. You have to admit what you don't know about another. You have to ask stupid questions to find your way in, so you don't do a stereotypical representation of a culture. So I think the research is really key to giving a respectful look at a culture that's not yours.
What was your writing process like, and how long did it take you to write your books? Did you ever come across writer's block?
Yes, absolutely. So the writing process was tortured, as it always is for me. I came back from my research trip really depressed. I couldn't write. I was so sad about what I'd seen, and I felt like there was no way anything I could write could make a difference. And I'm in a writer's group, and we meet every week, and you're supposed to come with pages. And every week I would show up with nothing. And finally, one of the members of the group said, just write a paragraph. Just write one scene. So I wrote a scene that happens right in the middle of the book. I didn't try to write page one and go from beginning to end. I wrote something that I needed to get out of my system. And then I wrote another one and another one. And that's why it's in that, that's part of the reason it's in that compressed vignette style. But the writing process, the writing actually gave me power over my depression. I think we feel depressed when we feel powerless, like there's nothing I can do about a bad situation. When you start taking steps, however small they may be, the depression starts to lift. So I think that is how I overcame the first block. There's always a block along the way. Many, many times you think, oh, nobody's going to read this. This is too dark. I didn't really do a good job on that paragraph yesterday. Who's going to care about this story? You torture yourself all the time, I think. It's a 2-year process writing the book, to answer the other part of the question. So you get dragged down in the sadness of the story and in your own self-doubt. And you start to think, why am I not writing Captain Underpants? Why am I not writing about vampires and something that has a more obvious commercial appeal? But you just have to believe in your ugly duckling that will hopefully become something more beautiful eventually. You have to also remind yourself that you're doing this on behalf of those girls in that world who need to have their lives seen by the rest of the world. And up until then, nobody had written about it.
What is it like after one of your books is published, and what effects do books like Never Fall Down and Sold have on their readers?
So what does it feel like after it's published? It feels like a million birthday parties. Like you've been working on something for so long, and it's finally out in the world. It's also really scary because reviews really matter to a book like this, a book that's on a tough topic. As I said, it's not going to just fly off the shelves because it's about, dating in a wealthy school in the Upper East Side in New York City. So you really need reviewers to understand the book and push it and promote it. And so you sit on the edge of your seat waiting to see, are the reviewers going to get it? And fortunately, I've been so lucky that people have gotten behind the books. And that's like getting a great report card, that you think you've done the work and you think you've done it as well as you can, but until somebody outside you validates it, you're never really sure. What effect do they have on readers? It's been really moving to me to have an experience like this. I never thought this book would get into schools. I thought it would be too risky. Many schools don't want to deal with any book that has to deal with sex because parents are going to get upset. So first of all, hats off to your teachers for bringing it into the classroom. But it has found a place in schools. And I think it's because your generation is very interested in social justice. I've been saying this for a long time, that kids of your generation are activists, and you're not waiting around for the grown-ups to do something about the causes you care about. And sadly, the school shootings and all the attention that the kids from Parkland have been getting sort of wakes up the rest of the world to, oh yeah, this generation isn't just glued to their phones. They are using social media and connectedness for change, and that you guys are very empathetic about the plight of your peers in different countries and different situations. So it's been really moving to connect with young readers in a way that is passionate and open-hearted.
How did you decide to write about the Cambodian genocide and not another genocide that has happened in the world? And how did you meet Arn and decide to write about his story?
I think it really starts with Arn. It starts with meeting him. So a man who has an apartment in my building said, I have an idea for you for your next book. And I always try to be polite and say, oh, okay, thanks. Because everybody has an idea for you. But I met Arn, who this man was friends with, and I instantly knew he had a beautiful and painful story to tell, but he could not tell it himself. I really believe in the idea of each of us finding the voice to tell our stories. But Arne's command of English and his trauma history and his lack of education made it nearly impossible for him to tell his story himself. So I was drawn to him as a person as opposed to the Cambodian genocide. Once I got to know him and his story, I was horrified how forgotten that genocide is. It killed 1/4 of their population over the course of 4 years. And the world doesn't really know about it in the way we know about the Holocaust or even the Armenian genocide. So it felt like a very good thing to bring that story forward. The other thing is that people in Cambodia tend not to talk about their trauma histories. There's a cultural attitude that you just keep that to yourself. And there's a lot of shame associated with having survived a genocide. Partly because the country is perceived as so brutal for what it did, but partly because people like Arne who survived had to do unsavory, immoral, they would be immoral under other circumstances. They had to do terrible things to survive. And so they really don't want to put themselves out there for the criticism that comes with a full scrutiny of their time during the genocide. And I guess the last thing is, as Americans, we are partly responsible. Our country is partly responsible for that genocide. We bombed Cambodia morning, noon, and night, and so destabilized the country. That is what gave rise to the Khmer Rouge. We were fighting a war in Vietnam next door. And we bombed Cambodia because we thought Vietnamese soldiers were sneaking over there. And you can't just bomb a neutral country. The other thing is, as Americans, we had our own kind of amnesia around Vietnam. People were sick of anything that had to do with Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War was such heartache for the United States and such a shameful history for many people about our past that they had fatigue about anything that had to do with Southeast Asia. So we did not pay attention to Cambodia. So it feels good to have brought it forward and to have a generation like you now understand it. The book has also been translated into Khmer, and so the kids, your generation in Cambodia, whose parents and grandparents were part of the genocide, they now know their own country's history.
What inspired you to write Never Fall Down through Arne's dialect? Was it ever hard to stay true to his thought process?
Great question. It was risky to use his voice because it's considered non-standard English. That as a white woman writing in the dialect of a Cambodian man could easily be perceived as insulting, or that I thought he was not smart, or he would come across as not smart. When white writers in the United States write using the African American dialect of Southerners, it's often perceived as a real put down. But so there was risk involved. But I really felt that his voice had a beauty to it. The way he spoke was so specific. The way he cobbled together English with Khmer made it very poetic in a way. I also thought that he's a great narrator. He's a funny, mischievous kid at the beginning. And you can follow this nice, sweet, young narrator into the darkness of the story, because it's almost like this kid is whispering in your ear and telling you firsthand what he experienced. I think it makes it, the hard reading of the book makes it somewhat easier. He has a sense of humor, too. I mean, he's got a funny thing about how he wants to be a little bit famous. but that partly saved his life. So it was a choice to write it in that dialect. I think it's hard for readers. The first 10 pages or so, you're like, what? What is this? And I risked turning readers off on that very crucial early part of the book. But once I got going, writing it in that format, I couldn't stop. And I was so drenched with Arn's voice that even after I turned off, I closed up my file for the day and started answering emails, I was still writing in that funny voice.
What was the most difficult scene to write in Never Fall Down? And was there a part of Arn's story you felt was too dramatic to share in the book?
Great question. The most difficult scene to write was where he kills the monkeys. It's just so awful and poignant. And he's, in this playful, childlike experience. They're dropping food that he's eating. Like they snuggle, a little baby snuggles up and takes a nap on his chest. And then he has to kill the little baby monkey to survive. And he feels like an animal himself. I think that there were ways in which that was the ultimate low point for him in the book. And in many ways, he did far worse things. But that one seemed to be so degrading. I forget the other half of your question, which was the hardest scene to write, and
Yeah, was there like a scene you left out?
oh, good point. No, Arn told me everything, and he didn't say, "Ooh, leave that part out. I'm kind of embarrassed about that." He needed and wanted a full confession and a full accounting. He wanted to stand up and say, "I'm accountable. I was a victim and I was a perpetrator. These things happened to me, and these are the things I did." He didn't want to keep anything in the shadows. And so as a result, he's a different person. He is much more of a man than a child. He was kind of childlike when I first met him. And he owned it all, and nobody judged him. The book came out and people saw him as a kid who had to do what he had to do to survive. And I think he feels much freer. So I give him a lot of credit. We all hold something back that we don't tell people out of shame. And I think it's ourselves who really suffer. It's so freeing to tell somebody you're the thing you're most embarrassed about, and to have the other person say, "It's okay. You don't need to embarrass. You don't be embarrassed. You don't need to hold the shame you carry for that." There's an expression that says we're only as sick as our secrets. And I think there's health in putting sunlight on your secrets.
How did your view of Cambodia change after you researched and wrote Never Fall Down?
Oh, that's a great question. My view of Cambodia was stuck in the time of the genocide. Everything I'd read about the brutality and the primitive quality of the way people lived under the Khmer Rouge, that idea of going back to year zero, where there's no money, there's no technology, no one has a personal identity, all of that, like they really did take Cambodia back in time. Between our bombing of the country and the Khmer Rouge's brutality, they turned the clock back. So I expected to arrive in that country. So I get there, and Phnom Penh is a thriving city with young people on mopeds and theaters and dance and great food and universities. It was so pleasing to see the youth in the country. As often happens after a war or a genocide, there's a big population boom. people start having bigger families, and whether it's conscious or not, to repopulate the country with youth and babies and vigor and, you know, something that's forward looking. It happens in almost every country after a war. And so the population in Cambodia is disproportionately young. So to see all these young people who didn't have the genocide experience and just want to, you know, get jobs and go to the nightclubs and get the coolest new phones, just like people in other countries. I think that was what was so shocking to me, that there's a vibrancy and a health and an optimism in that country. There is also still terrific poverty outside the cities. People live with no running water, no electricity. They farm, they have chickens. There's still an enormous poverty, and backwardsness is the wrong word, because that conveys a superiority that I think that our culture is better. But a primitive, harsh conditions that people live in, and that's a result of the genocide. One thing that's worth knowing is that after the genocide, there were no lawyers left in Cambodia, and there were only a handful of doctors. So, because the Khmer Rouge targeted anybody with education. So they had to build a healthcare system from scratch. And if you think about that, like training doctors, training nurses, there was no medical school for them to go to. So they sent people to medical schools in France and in the US, and some of them stayed in France and the US, and some of them came back and established healthcare and schools and courts and all of that, the things that make up a modern society. So there are ways in which the country is still behind, and there are ways in which it's really very forward-looking.
All right, guys, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Soul. So, Patricia, would you want to come up?
Yeah, the second one.
Let's do the first one again, just in case there's... Oh, yeah, this one, vignette.
What made you decide to write Sold in a vignette format instead of a regular format?
It was partly the difficulty of writing it at all. I could only stay with the material for a little period of time every day because it was so dark. But then I realized that format allowed me to write really compressed vignettes, and each one would stand for other scenes. So in other words, you don't have to write about Lakshmi being raped 55 times. Write one vignette that has a lot of power, and you know that it happens many times after that. So you don't have to drag the reader through a repetition of really horrible events. It also allowed me to use beautiful language, or I hope it was beautiful language, to elevate the story. So if it's a tough story, a brutal story, I don't have to use brutal language to tell it. I can try very hard to use poetic, I guess, or graceful language. What I found is, too, that it also made it easier for the reader, that there's a lot of white space around each of those vignettes, or especially around some of the really short ones. And you can catch your breath. And you can also bring your imagination into that white space. And I think it helps readers, too, who say, okay, I'll read one more, and then I'll turn the page. All right, I can one more. You sort of dose out the horror gently and in small quantities, so people just don't feel bombarded and completely dragged down by the book. I think it's a hard book to read, and any opportunity to put it down, any excuse to put it down, means you might not finish it. So I think it allowed for a gentler reading experience. Although I will tell you, my agent hated the idea. I turned the whole thing into her, and she said, "Oh, right, a book about genocide told in poetry, that has bestseller written all over it." And she was obviously being sarcastic, but I wasn't going to change it. Some people look at that format and it's an impediment. And some people look at it and think, okay, I can do that.
What was your biggest concern while you were writing about human trafficking?
My biggest concern was that no one would care, that it was just too dark. And a lot of people, while I was writing it, would say, are you sure this is a kid's book? And I stuck to it that it was, because it's happening to kids. So why wouldn't you tell other young people about what's happening to their peers somewhere else? I thought it would be censored. And one of the interesting things that happened was once the world started to find out about child trafficking, religious groups started to get on board fighting it, as well as more secular liberal groups. Groups that are usually at odds with each other found common cause here, because everybody can agree that the selling of children is a bad thing. You know, we can't agree on climate change, we can't agree on guns, we can't agree on a lot of things. But this somehow found a space in the cultural conversation where two sides could come together. So my fear was that it would just come and go, that it was too dark, that it wouldn't make a ripple. And fortunately, that didn't happen. I also thought people might think poorly of me. I know that sounds a little weird, but all my books are dark, about cutting, genocide, child trafficking, you know, a girl who's shot by the Taliban. The people would think I was some kind of, that there was something wrong with me, that I was drawn to these dark topics, that that I don't know, liked trafficking in sad stories. I would love to be able to go to dinner parties and cocktail parties and tell people that I wrote, you know, picture books about a dog named Biscuit. I wish that that was me, but I'm not. And so what I found is the opposite. There's some people who can't tolerate these stories. My own sister will not read my books. She said they make her too sad. But other people are pleased that somebody is writing these books and bringing them to young audiences.
Why did you leave Sold so open-ended?
That's the question I get more than any other. And there's so many schools that I visit where the kids are furious about that ending. And I see some smiles in the audience. It was an intentional choice to leave it open like that so that it would bother you, so it would stay on your mind, so that you would engage in the creative process with me in wondering, well, what happens? Does she have HIV? Does she ever go home? And in a way, I think that's better than trying to work out everything so that, you know, it's all tidy at the end and you know how you're supposed to feel when it's over. I did write other endings, and my editor said, nope, you end it just as she's taking that first step toward her freedom. And that she was right, because the stuff I wrote after she left the brothel didn't have any energy in it. God bless you. Didn't have any tension. It was just resolution. And I needed it to make myself feel better about what happened to Lakshmi. But it was flat on the page, honestly. So that's why it ended the way it did. Everybody asks me, will I write a sequel? No. I do often go to schools and we'll do a creative writing exercise where kids write their own endings to the book. And so many schools, especially if I'm working with younger kids, Mumtaz dies in a hail of bullets. because kids are just so angry and they want an end to what happened to Lakshmi, and they want revenge on somebody like Mumtaz, which is a completely understandable response. But unfortunately, it's not a realistic one.
Have you ever gotten any pushback regarding your portrayal of the Khmer Rouge or sex traffickers?
Let's see, the only pushback that I got regarding Soul is that there's a white savior. There's an American who comes to the rescue. And of course, I wrote this book quite a while ago, but before people were so all about how we look at that whole white savior myth. Because the white savior can also be an abusive predator type. It can be an arrogance that our culture understands how to fix your problems better than your culture understands how to fix your problems. When I wrote the book, the rescues were being done by Americans. That has changed. There's now a very active community in those countries doing their own rescues. But what I wrote was realistic at the time. The other thing was I was writing for an American audience primarily, and I knew that there was in that book there's a sea of brown faces and weird names, and that American readers needed one character that they could identify with or see themselves possibly as being in that book. And so it was a conscious choice to create an identifiable character. If I had to do it over again, I would make the rescue be done by a local Indian member of law enforcement or something like that. And the book has been made into a play where they changed it because of that question of like the heroic white man coming in and rescuing the dark-skinned woman. It's also been made into a movie where unfortunately I love the movie, but unfortunately they exaggerated the role of the white Americans and put movie stars in those parts. They had to use movie stars to get funding. Otherwise they would never have been able to make the movie. And to their credit, those movie stars did the movie for virtually no money. But it puts way more attention on the white people in the movie.
As a writer, what do you hope readers will take away from your books?
There's no particular message. And I think that any book that tries to preach to you, you're going to go, no thanks, I'll make up my own mind. So I hope that just by telling a good story, you make up your own minds what you think or what you might want to do with that information. I think that's the only respectful thing to do to a reader. And I think young readers in particular instantly smell it if a book is trying to push a message and instantly resist it. You can make up your own mind. If there's a theme that runs throughout all the books, and it's not a conscious one, I didn't realize it until I looked back on the books, but it's about finding your own voice and telling your own story, that by speaking, you are freed from that story. You're not the sum effects, you're not the sum total of what other people did to you. By telling your own story, you claim the narrative, you decide who you are and what you want to share, and you unload the parts of your story that you shouldn't have to be carrying around anymore. Whether it's a girl who cuts herself, whether it's Arn who participated in atrocities, whether it's a girl who's sold against her will, it's by speaking out and grabbing a hold of your own story that you have power.
All right, guys. I think that's all we have time for this call, so can we thank
such a pleasure to talk to you. Your questions were so deep and thoughtful, and I love the well-organized way that everybody comes up and takes a turn. Sometimes I'll do a Skype visit, and the kids will just sit there going, "No, you talk to her. I don't want to talk to her." So this was really good. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll
All
call
right,
you back
I'll
in a
see
little
you.
bit. Okay, thank you.
Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.